All right. Welcome back to our Sovereign Cloud Community live stream for this week. We are going to talk today about open source and how open source can be the foundation for sovereignty, for cloud sovereignty. Um, Try to put different aspects into it, different perspectives, and going to, yeah, finish the session with some myths, with some call outs, some shout outs, things you should keep in mind. As usual, if you would like to ask questions, feel free to write them into the chat or drop us a message in Zulip or via email. We're more than happy to answer it. And if you have any idea for a great talk, for any content you would like to put in context of sovereignty, can be data, can be AI, can be cloud, can be tech, please approach us too. We are happy to host you for this one. So, as said, for today, we are jumping right into the open source as a foundation for digital sovereignty. And this is, for me, one of my most loved, most favorite topics, I would say, so far. It is relevant to me because was over 3 years or almost 3 years part of the Kubernetes release team. I'm being very active in the cloud native ecospace, being an ambassador and being an advisory board member to the Linux Foundation Europe. So I have some history, some ideas about open source, and I think it's one of the most realistic ways how we in Europe especially can achieve some kind of sovereignty. To start this whole thing, we have always this very interesting question about like which cloud provider should we choose? And I think that's the absolute wrong perspective. The question should be more, how do we avoid dependencies? Or how do we build platforms that are as less as dependent as they can be towards the infrastructure, towards other technologies, so that we have their, so as much as possible, so-called independent environment here. And this is more like the thought of like you need to think architecturally about a different perspective, because the cloud provider is quite often more a business decision, depending on who gives you the best price over which period, rather than a technology decision, which would be the best provider to guarantee you some sovereignty aspects over that time period. And I think this is a fundamental different approach you have to think about. We see quite often that there's the try to put those things into the same decision bucket, but we also see that the money is quite often the more compelling element here, which has a higher weight into driving this decision. Just to shortly recap about cloud sovereignty, what is the important aspects or the important pillars when we talk about the cloud sovereignty. Um, One of the key elements here is the data sovereignty. So, where at which point in time is my data? Who can access it? Does it flow somewhere else? And so on. And it's sometimes more even a legal aspect which comes on top of it. So, we have a compliance and a legal certainty which we need to keep in mind, especially in Europe, where, as I heard on a conference that was the saying Europe is acting. Europe is writing and publishing a lot of acts in the last years about cyber resiliency, about data governance, about AI, and so on. And all the countries have to find, in addition, some regulations around it. So, data sovereignty and the legal aspects are very close related to each other. But the one thing is purely the legal evaluation and frames for it, while on data sovereignty, we're talking about the technology, how to protect it. And this technology is then also relevant that we can ensure a kind of technological independence. Always needs to be careful here. Independency from the technology doesn't mean that we have to build it completely by ourselves. That would be also crazy in some way. And this whole approach then is also part of a strategic flexibility, especially in times where we have geopolitical pressure. Um, it might be relevant at the one or other point to reposition my IT strategy and just to prevent my own company, just to prevent my own data, my intellectual property, we might need to reflect on how we are doing certain things. In this context, we also see then on the other hand side that if we talk about why we should think about open source and especially in sovereignty or moving away from foreign driven systems and solutions, is that we often stuck into a vendor lock-in. We have to take that by care. Not all of it is continuously true. Some of the vendor lock-ins are at the same time also some possibilities, right? So a technical dependency to a proper API is never good, yet quite often proprietary software uses open source to provide enhanced enterprise features. So they use some standards to provide even more leveraged possibilities. The compliance risk, I think we talked in the last sessions quite a lot about it. We have limited control if we are not able to control the system. But we have to also consider here what we really talk about. Is a governmental position really taking away data? Most likely not. Can a governmental position ensure or order that certain systems are shut down for some companies or even governmental roles? Yes, sure, it happened already. So compliance risks here are very huge. The exploding costs, we especially see that is when we have like some acquisitions going on, right? And we see that frequently through acquisitions. One of the key part of a company to compensate that they've bought for multiple hundred millions another company is like raise the prices of their product. When there is not so much options, like when we talk about virtualization options or services, it become a problem to migrate away from this exploding cost environment. You usually have to pay a lot of it during the time where you have to run the licenses. And also, if you want to migrate, it also costs, again, a lot of money. Lack of transparency and strategic risk. You do not know exactly what the system does and how it works. It's a black box quite often. And it is also that through this missing transparency, you have a lack of visibility of who's doing what in the system, right? This is a strategic risk perspective. And then we have the limited innovation aspect. Proprietary software is quite often not that innovative, but we have also to be careful here again. So on the one hand side, they use quite often open source tools or solutions to provide new features. And on the other hand side, we need to strictly differentiate between like this foundational layer, which is quite often the majority of a company, and then they have niche products. And these niche products are usually do not have any open source alternative. But in my opinion, that's totally fine, right? I was in a media company before, and you have a very specific software to schedule media files with advertisements for TV. So this is such a ultra crazy niche where we talk about optimization, we talk about um, fast changing some video files and so on, which is so highly complicated that it doesn't make sense for a company to build it open source or share it with other media companies. But in the ground foundation for it, there's a database. This database is exchangeable. It can be a paid proprietary software, but you can also take an open source software. We also come quite often talking about the hidden costs of proprietary clouds. And again, this is all things which you very fast find if you search for it, if you make some research for the topic. And my purpose is not to just blindly repeat what is the big saying, but share also here some perspectives of it and also put it into a less opinionated position, right? The same like with vendor login. That's so true. But also with the hidden costs, it's sometimes true and sometimes not. Depending on whom you look at, we can see quite often that there's a point of like open source is extremely more cheaper, 40 to 60%, 50%, however you want to name it. That's true and that's not true. If you save license fees, for sure you can save a lot of costs. But on the other hand, you quite often need to also serve that software, you need to maintain it. What we quite often see here is also an argue that on the operational level, open source costs way more. I think yes and no. So the infrastructure costs, hosting it, database, network traffic, whatever, quite often is the same. So there's this we can equal out. The question is if the license which you pay for the software comes with the managed service of a proprietary software or not. Because if you have just that you support possibility calling someone, it means that you still have to operate the software in the end. And that's the same then with open source, right? The only difference is in open source, you not directly can call someone. Also, there's quite often enterprise support. And with proprietary software, you often pay just that you can call someone. And this works also not always very good. We made our own experience when I was enterprise architect that quite often the service support stuff doesn't worth the money. So I think the only good price comparison we can do is between like a fully managed service on a cloud provider versus a fully open source self-managed solution. This is the only way where we can find a real difference in the costs. For most of the other stuff, for most of the other scenarios, costing in the end will be the same, but differently structured. Some issues with cloud pricing is also that we have hidden costs around it for network traffic, for data transfer, for API calls. That's not necessarily a solution or cannot be solved by an open source software because it's a provider generic issue. However, in European sovereign cloud providers, you very often do not pay anything for network traffic and data transfer. That means if you have your own API setup, you can cut out 10, 15, 20% of your overall costs for just network communication by going open source. But you have to maintain a little bit more. The other thing is that you have maybe an issue with multi-cloud flexibility because you cannot just easily migrate away from one thing to the other. Also, you use standardized tools to build in different cloud environments similar approaches. Practically, it is different. So if you build something for an orange cloud and then for a blue cloud and then for, I don't know, a colorful cloud, you have to rebuild everything by scratch. You cannot just copy paste it. And then depending on which regions you're going, like for example, China, you have to rebuild again everything because it has the same color, but it's not the same platform. And then we have some predictability about costs. I have to say, if you take a look on the cloud provider itself, usually the price is going down or stay the same, but your performance increase. And depending on how you want to interpret it, I like to say you get usually over time for less money, more performance. That's the actual trend in cloud environments. Even some huge changes in electricity costs and so on were not really reflected in the cloud provider landscape because there's enough margin normally for the provider to balance this out. So you see, we cannot like really use the hidden cost perspective for proprietary clouds as the key argument because it is in a very fine, detailed area where we need to differentiate case by case. And that's why also my initial question is not like, shall we go to cloud provider A or B? No, the question is how we can reduce the dependency towards this cloud provider. And if we save then some money, perfect. But you don't have to. So, what makes open source anyhow a solution? And I think the biggest key aspect here is about transparency. So that we have a complete open source project means that you can look and read the source code. You can go into, you have no black boxes, no weird stuff going on. But you need to also have the time to understand it. So it's one of the key argument always that open source, you can always take a look at the code. How many people do you know that really had a look on the code? That's especially with large projects unrealistic. No one will read several 100,000 lines of code to understand how and what is built into. But the good thing is you don't have to. We have the community aspect here, right? And the control aspect. You have tons of people, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who are doing that for you. And if they have an issue, they will report it. This causes a safety net for open source, and also guarantee you that you will adhere to some kind of standards in the end. You also have the freedom, quite often, to take open source and do what you want with it. That's so true. Depends on the open source licensing. I do not want to go too much into the details. For end users, quite often there is no overall issue on that. If you are a commercial provider that practically use open source to build a system or a solution to resell this open source, then you quite often cannot really do that, right? So open source is always or quite often built on a fairness principle. You can use it for your own good, but you cannot use to make money for yourself for it. Sustainability, that's a thing which is true, which is not true. If an open source project is part of a larger foundation, like Linux Foundation, CNCF, Apache, Mozilla, whatever, the risk that the open source project will be vanishing is limited and reduced. There's no company behind which can run empty or run insolvents. But the reality for most open source projects is that they are developed by a company and that the company spends several hundred thousands to millions of euros and dollars and whatsoever on building that open source project. And then you have contributors who do that on their free will, unpaid, to deliver enhancements and so on. The thing is, therefore, that it is true and it is not true. I always take Kubernetes here as a good example. Google spent every year multiple million US dollars just to provide the infrastructure for building and integrating Kubernetes, for testing it, ensuring that it is reaching this cloud provider level of quality that is needed. And without that funding, no one could ever build Kubernetes because it's just so expensive to do so. Yeah. So sustainability is an aspect that is not always true and interpreted like we see here. I got asked after one of the other session, like, how does one of these sovereign open source stack can look like? And I need to say, I'm not a fan of the definition of stacks. We have too many stacks in Europe. We have the Euro stack, we have the sovereign cloud stack, we have the Deutschland stack, and so on. My problem with stacks is like, you cannot take anything out of this picture. You see some kind of technologies, and they might help you to understand in which area we are talking about what. But it's not that you necessarily really get a direct implementable value out of it. So I would prefer to have here some blueprint which you can start with, like literal infrastructure as a code, for example, or a composition of multiple infrastructure as code tools. But the stack itself doesn't help. However, what we can read out of the stack and all the stacks which we currently see that are defined is like Kubernetes and container going to be the golden standard to abstract away your tools from the provider underlying technology. I would even go one step more further and would say, like, maybe we should even consider WebAssembly as one part of the solution. But as I talked with a dear friend of mine who is one of the WebAssembly experts, he says, like, WebAssembly is too complicated, too technology-wise complex that you cannot sell it to the business. So it's on the technical people to bring that innovation without overcomplicating the business part in it. Nevertheless, you see here a few technologies that are almost standardized, and this is a more relevant aspect, I would say. You can use for observability almost everything. There's a standard around it that helps you to scrape this information. It's not Prometheus, also kind of a standard, but you have OpenTelemetry. You have a standard for storage. You have a standard for networking. There's a few standards around message queuing. There's 1-2 standards around security. So the message here is like, it almost doesn't matter which tools you're going to use in such open source stack. If you use some kind of standardization engine like Kubernetes is or like OpenStack, you have a huge possibility to build an environment as you want. And this point we hear very fairly quite often, oh, but then it gets so complicated and we need so much power and capabilities to do so and so on. Don't waste your time to build the foundational layer. You do not need to build Kubernetes by yourself. You can always buy some tools for that if you want to or have the budget for. And yes, there's also a lot of German and European providers that can help you with that. You do not have to rely on any kind of cloud provider to get this capability. The security aspect I really would like to highlight here again, because we will also later come the myth perspective on the security aspect, but security in open source is large. For well-maintained open source projects, if there are CVEs popping up that are reporting some insecurity for some other components, programming language, libraries in open source that are usually fixed within hours. The 1 day time frame, that's a thing which counts if the CVE pops up on a Saturday night, Sunday morning, right? Under the week, usually they roll out security patches for large open source projects within just a few hours. And that, in comparison to proprietary systems, is a huge help. Now, we see here that also on the commercial side, quite often the tools getting in their SLAs, meanwhile, very hard limits of fixing security patches. The only problem is that you sometimes do not know what they're using in their applications. So it's nice that you put that into a piece of paper, but how you want to prove it that it's in that. And reality is also back to my times as enterprise architect in media and energy and utility and transportation. A security fix can also take a year. And that's the harsh reality. And in some industries, like healthcare, there's sometimes no security patches for months or years. Because they assume that we have a contractual time frame where software needs to run for 5 years, and the entire system is made secure, but not the software itself. I do not like that perspective, but proprietary systems in my opinion, on a security perspective, quite often lack the speed of and the transparency of fixing their internal systems and problems. This transparency, on the other side, has also a few very positive aspects. So your systems are easy to audit. They are easy to prove if they are compliant with some rules. Backdoors have hard time to find their way in. There are a few cases where are backdoors built in, but they usually are stuck into that from the beginning. So it's not something which later was added, but usually was already incrementally built from the beginning. And then you have also like the community vigilance. So you have thousands of people looking into your software, what it is doing and how to fix it, and how to prevent that something harmful can be done with it. This has something to do also with the open source ethics here on this point. And how Linus say that, well, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Or in other words, with so much people taking care about one thing, it's very hard to increase vulnerabilities to harm it, to make it unsecure. So it's really like the mass of the people who takes care about open source project is carrying out the value for an open source project and prevents that something harmful can happen with it. The innovation without borders is a phrase which I took, I think, from the CNCF, from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Why we have innovation without borders is that as of today, practically every innovation is based on open source. You have almost none or no innovation that is based on proprietary software. If you talk about AI, machine learning, all this cool stuff, that's done by TensorFlow or PyTorch. PyTorch, for example, was developed by the UC Berkeley and is still maintained by the UC Berkeley, so University of Berkeley. Kubernetes become practically the default orchestrator for computing workload, right? Same like with container technologies. So a huge part of how we do IT and how we changed IT to be done, also in the perspective of AI and so on, is all relying on open source. I had once the luck to meet a few guys from Black Forest Labs that have worked on Stable Diffusion. And the Stable Diffusion, this is this process of generating very realistic pictures. They developed in a university. So also this part was open, and huge parts of it are still open. And that gives us unlimited possibilities, because also sometimes just to compose a few open source tools together provide us a new perspective of doing things. To give there some more numbers to it, there's a big thumb rule saying like over 90% of Fortune 500 use open source. I would say almost 100% of companies globally, every company is using open source. The only thing is sometimes they don't know it or do not do it strategically. But if you use Linux, that's open source. If you use the newest version of Windows, many parts of it in it are open source. Programming languages are open source, web server are open source, network component, network traffic, storage driver, all of this stuff is open source. So everyone will and have use of open source. The other cool thing is that we see way faster development track in the open source field. So where proprietary software, even if they have a frequent release sometimes, and they change this release behavior from a big bang once per year release or every 6 months to way frequent. But this pressure to be more frequent and releasing is something that comes from open source. Because in open source, it's standard since 10 years to release every few weeks, a little update, a little patch, every few months, a major release, and so on. And this causes a huge amount of pressure for proprietary software provider to also find a faster speed and find a better release cycle. The only issue is on the other hand side that companies often quite struggle with deploying so often feature releases That's also a reason why Kubernetes, for example, have turned down from 4 releases per year to just 3 releases per year. And even that is for many, many companies quite too fast. But open source is way more than just technology. I always say open source, building platforms, this is about people, culture, and process. The technology is just what you use to realize it, but people, culture, and process is what you really use and need to make a successful transformation, a successful introduction of new principles of open source, and so on. You need to change your culture. You cannot just introduce open source and hope everything will be good. Open source comes always with a community, and you need to find a way to promote this inner source community also to your organization and allow others to contribute to your systems, platforms, and so on. Never be so, I do not want to say selfish, but with too much nose up, believe that you know what's best for everyone. Get feedback from the teams, and that's just a cultural change aspect that the experts are in the field and doing something, so get their feedback, what they maybe would like to have seen changed in the services you are providing. And also in the talent acquisition, we quite often see that you either have extreme experts in a field with a proprietary software, I don't know, like how it's called, Click, or like Tableau, for example. But this is not always compelling for everyone, because if you know this one tool, you know this one tool, but you cannot really translate that experience to another one. Yes, a BI system might be a BI system, but it's still extremely different when you go from one thing to the other. While in open source, if you talk about one specific tool, you usually talk about its standards. So the standard to operate databases on Kubernetes are based on controllers and operators. And how to attach storage to a database that it is resilient is also a standard. What does it change in this whole perspective is that you can replace any kind of database at any point in time, but how it is working is still the same. And this is relevant for the talent acquisition, because if you are an expert in different kind of open source tools, you will be also able to adapt to new technologies and go faster with the time. You do not have to relearn the entire stack. You just have to relearn maybe that it's not a Postgres, but a MySQL, but the way how it attaches storage, the way how it does backups, the way how traffic is routed, and so on. This is all standardized. And then you have the social responsibility. And I think that's an aspect that, especially in Europe, we should highlight more, because we quite often just look a little bit selfish into what we should do, but we forget that there's 10, 20 other countries on the planet that have also high sovereignty standards. They just don't call it like that. They really call it their national interest. We have some problem with this wording, maybe, in especially Germany, but also in Europe, to really call our national perspective and emphasize that. On the other hand side, when many nations come together, you have suddenly a social responsibility, and investing into open source, and that's sometimes the biggest problem which we have in Europe, that we do not invest into it, but you should invest into open source, because then all the countries that we have in the European Union, that we have on the European country, on the continent, and also beyond, can really use it. So relevant aspect here, we have a social responsibility, but we do not really take it up to account at the moment in Europe. If we take now all of that and want to be successful with it, so we have people, culture, processes, we have open source technology that we want to introduce. We know that we should take care about the architecture and not just ask which cloud provider we should use. Then there's certain aspects that might make this change successful. For sure, you need the management buy-in. Someone wants to give the money, but you also need to find a way to push sometimes a little bit through. You have enterprise support that sometimes, as well before, one of the false statements that there's no real support for open source. But the reality is almost every open source tool has an enterprise version, um, because there's companies behind it who develop it, right? So you can find support. And if you do not want to have that, then there's other companies out there that are specialized on open source. So you will always find someone who really will do and will be able to do support. And sometimes they will do it better than just any kind of license agreement. You have standards and governance, which comes from open source, but you need to align them with your own internal standards and governments and with rules that apply for your company and for your domain and industry. And how we can make that all possible is, again, you need to build your inner source community. Community engagement is extremely important. And you need to call people for, become your little ambassador, your internal, how to say, go-to guys for certain kind of technologies. And they have to actively participate in your inner project. And ideally, you also are actively contributing to an open source project in the outer world, right? We have the automation part, and I think this is the most critical one. Many companies are not good in the automation part. We have seen already very large projects that are failing because suddenly the development platform doesn't work anymore, because suddenly the CI/CD pipelines doesn't work anymore. Why? Because no one look and really emphasize that you have to build a reliable software delivery pipeline. And you have to measure. You have to define goals and you have to measure. It doesn't help if you just imagine and calculate once in an Excel sheet how much money you can save or how much more sovereign you can become if you use open source. But you need to also define exactly how it looks like before and how it looks after the transformation. This is super relevant because that's something where, in the end, a company, stakeholders, your management, your board will question your success. In the end, transforming from a pure proprietarian environment, that's what I've done also quite often in the past, to an open source ecosystem, that's really a journey. And sometimes you have to throw away stuff which you have built. Especially in Germany and Europe, it's always like, oh, we have paid for it, so we have to use it. Yeah, but if you buy bullshit, then throw away your bullshit. So it's not a sprint. Start with a small, little incremental releases, changes, and then scale smartly. Find the environments where it makes sense for you step by step to introduce more and more and more open source components. I love myths. I love the myth also about open source, and I think it's sometimes good to challenge this also. Myth number one, for example, is that open source is unsecure and unstable. And that's always, in my opinion, in my experience, better to say, comes a statement from people who look like 10 years ago or 15 years ago on a weird Linux distribution and got the feeling, nah, that's not for me. I think people should more often take a look on open source because there's very good solutions for everything available. And the reality is the most relevant systems on that planet for everyone is running on Linux. No one puts something relevant on Windows. You would be crazy with that. And even the newest Windows versions are incorporating parts of the Linux kernel, meanwhile, for stability reason and security reason. Not saying that there's not maybe something relevant running on a Windows machine, but the majority is running on Linux for good reasons. Second myth, there's no support for open source. I talked already about it. If you talk about Linux, there's multiple companies providing enterprise support. If you talk about Kubernetes, there's multiple enterprise versions for Kubernetes. If you talk about databases, whatever, you will always find a company that does support for it if you really want it or need it. Open source is only for tech companies. It comes from tech companies, I need to say and need to admit that. I think especially for small and medium enterprises, this gives you the chance not only to just replace maybe some tools in your landscape, but and also like reduce the costs of the tools itself. But it's maybe even a very, very good argument for speeding up some of your innovation and to reinvent your infrastructure and your systems, use the way how you provide solutions. It's not only for tech companies. Um, Many tools have become extremely simple to use, also because of standardization engines like Kubernetes are. The only thing is you have to learn once a new stack. And this is what is the highest criticality. And that's also like what we quite hear. Also fitting to the next myth, migration is too complex or the tools are too complex. Yes, it is complicated, but remember this point in time when you have migrated away from your bare metal one server down in your cellar to an entire virtualized data center? That was also complex. And you also spent years, 2 years, 3 years of migrating just a few simple apps to make that run. Now, welcome to actually a very old kind of reinvention. Kubernetes has meanwhile a few years, and sorry that always to point out here Kubernetes, but it's really one part of the foundational layer for open source in cloud sovereignty. Mm. Nevertheless, if this migration is done right and you do it with some care, and you have a good plan how step by step you do it, not in a big bang release, but like in eatable step sizes, you will very fast face a good and initial return on investment. If you again focus here also like building a platform in an environment that is independent from the underlying infrastructure first, you have all the kind of flexibilities. You can go to any kind of cloud provider. If you go to a European cloud provider, you will save costs because they're usually 30 to 50% cheaper, just without any kind of saving plans. You don't need a saving plan. And you save on invisible costs, network, APIs, and so on. Last myth, proprietary software is more innovative. I talked about this also already quite deeply. It is maybe true for individual domains where you have very specialized software for very, very special use cases. Even so, then I would question if they're sometimes innovative. Again, I've spent many, many years in energy and a couple of years in media. I haven't seen that much innovation movements in that time. While on the other hand side, Kubernetes and TensorFlow and PyTorch and I don't know, whatever else is out there as an open source tool really has changed the market. It really had a heavy, heavy influence. Again, like PyTorch, UC Berkeley, completely open source. That is the foundational tool you need to you use to train OpenAI and Claude and however they are called. How to do that exactly? That is maybe the intellectual property of the company. But the tools are used for it are all open source. They all are the enabler for innovation. And all large changes in the last years in IT are all coming from open source. You can also take blockchain and all that stuff into. Most of them are open source. Cloud native, AI, Gen AI, all has an open source background. Also here, reality check. Many of these open source tools are funded and paid by large companies. That's also a true aspect, but they are out there for free. So it's never about the tool, it's what you're doing with it. It's a question how you use the tool, not that you use the tool. There's also this open source scale trap. I do not understand why people don't checking where does an open source tool sometimes belongs to, because they are very, very large foundations. And this even still happens with like Linux, like, oh, yeah, but Linux, it's what it is. Maybe better to use Windows because there's a large company behind. Linux is the largest open source project on this world, or one of the largest projects out there. The other large ones are Kubernetes, programming languages like Python, and so on. They have so many contributors that most companies cannot dedicate so much energy and time to a proprietary software. And there's quite often this false perspective that open source is done by a few people in their cellar, and that's why we should not use it. But the reality is, it maybe have started by a few people in the cellar, but if the project is a good idea, if the open source project is great, then it very fast scales up. It very fast will find a foundation, can be Apache or Eclipse. We'll talk about more like data or development. Or we have also, meanwhile, the NeoNephos Foundation in Europe that is more driven by German and European companies that have open sourced certain tools and also Linux distributions and stuff like that. So usually, many of the open source tools have something bigger behind it, if we talk about the standardization part. And then there's a few open source tools that maybe do not belong to any of these foundations, yet they are very strongly staffed with hundreds of people normally contributing to it. So open source is not like, I don't know, 20 years ago where a couple of people just doing something and hope that anyone will use it. That's wrong. Open source is seriously large scale, and if you take a look how open source is built, it's insane. Last but not least, I also want to give a warning, I need to say. Especially in Europe, you have a couple of voices, and unfortunately, those voices are also located in more or less relevant positions of shaping European digital sovereignty, who demand that we only use European open source. And frankly speaking, that's absolutely nonsense. Yeah. Open source is open, and open source is for everyone. The problem is that in Europe, we do not spend time and capacity and money on open source. We use it, but we do not contribute to it. And this leads to that most open source tools are just developed by US and China. Even so, that there's a lot of smart people and many cool open source tools that have come up to be the foundation for even more larger ecosystems are from Europe or are from Germany or France or whatever. They are not paid by European companies. And that is a problem, right? It's up to you people to invest money into it, to invest into the contribution, to build your knowledge, to bring in your expertise. Because with every contribution you do, and it doesn't matter how you're doing it, but you can contribute in code, you can give ideas, feature requests, events, whatever. If you do that, then you can bring in some kind of, let's say, European spirit. You can bring in your ideas, your feature, and then the contribution ship can change from being 50% US and 40% China to maybe 30%, right? But it all comes and goes with your contribution. If you do not contribute, you will not achieve it. And I had this discussion already with some of those people. The perspective here is like, yeah, but how we want to change that, right? How we want to change the company. So, frankly speaking, I believe it's easier to ask and maybe even force companies to invest into open source than to start build your own stuff. Because to make your own open source project relevant, you have to scale it, you have to find a community for it, you need a platform for it. But if you build European open source, it means that you also logically will not go to the open source conferences because they are all from a foreign organization. So you do not have a platform, you do not have anyone who wants to use it. And we have a few European solutions also as maybe an alternative. It's not an alternative, but thought so as an alternative for OpenStack or Kubernetes. 10, 15 years in development, still not relevant. So maybe sometimes we do some stuff wrong. And to think too much in this perspective, we have to invent something new just to claim it being European. That's not working. Because ultimately, it would mean that you also need to write a new license which ensures that you always have at least 51% of ownership to that open source project, based on a European company or government, and that you do not move this away. This is not sovereign anymore, just to give it a name. If you have such a high level of control, it doesn't mean sovereignty. You just take it away from others. So open source lives through all of us. If you have not contributed yet to open source, you really should consider it. If you work in a large company, bring it up to the table. I'm pretty sure your company uses tons of open source. Do not pay a dime. Do not go and contribute. It's millions of euros and dollars you do not spend on proprietary and software, but maybe you should spend some time on contributing it and bring in your thoughts, ideas, and direction to represent European values, to bring in our morale, our ethics, our idea of democracy into such tools. And maybe then some of the open source projects can become European. That's my last word for today. With that, thank you very much again for coming by. If you have any kind of questions, feel free to drop me, write us an email, join the Zulip. We are super happy to discuss. Right now, we are setting up the next topics for the next months. So if you have any wishes, ideas, if you want to present something by yourself, feel free to reach out to us. We are more than happy to have you. And with that, I will close it for today. I'm pretty sure you maybe have some more time to go for today, but I wish you already a very nice weekend. And then see you next time around. Thank you very much.